What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, there is not a topic in the health realm that gets our attention more than the issue of cancer. We have all been faced with it in our families. We've all struggled to ask whether there's new hope in the field and whether there are new possibilities for breakthroughs. And that's one of the questions we're going to be posing today to our guest on our podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a horrible, and I don't know what it is, whether it's the food, whether it's the environment that's causing it, but it's just, I think we got to solve this problem.
Well, I know that at the end of the Barack Obama administration, he put Joe Biden in charge of something that was like a war on cancer. But you've got to go back to 1971 when Richard Nixon called for a war on cancer. So we've been fighting cancer for a very long time. And undoubtedly, we've made a lot of progress. But we see all these cancer centers around the country, and we wonder, I mean, is there a permanency to this issue, or can we really slay the dragon ultimately?
You know, I often wonder, my question is, this is got to be a gazillion-dollar industry. You know, if they found the cure for cancer, would they tell us right away?
Well, we do pose that in this particular podcast because it is a question that one might, have. But having said that, I think what is more, important to me as I really thought about what it was that Dr. Scadden tells us is that really when we say cancer, we're really not talking about one thing.
No, you're right. There's many different types of cancer.
So we're making progress in certain areas, but if you've got a cancer that we're not making a lot of progress on, then of course it doesn't feel like progress.
Right. No, you're right there. So I mean, is it just one thing though? I think finding what's causing these cancers is...
it would be unimaginable if we could really have a breakthrough that helped us to figure out how can we do it and do it permanently and do it without any reserve, that there's going to be no trace of it ever again, like polio or whatever it might be. I don't think we're in for that in our lifetimes. I really don't, because cancer really has proven itself to be a remarkable foe to the medical community and to all of us, really. So let's explore this. The book is called Cancerland, a medical memoir by Dr. David Scadden, and you're going to find him to be fascinating today on America Trends. On the line with us is Dr. David Scadden. The book is called Cancerland, a medical memoir. And sometimes I think when we use the term cancer, we are looking at one thing that is really many things. And thus, as people look for hope, they might find it when they hear the word cure or a new breakthrough or what have you. But cancer is really hard to define and to limit in terms of the technologies that are needed to beat it back. And you make that point very clearly to us.
Cancers are as varied as there are tissues in our body. So there are cancers that can emerge from basically almost any of our organs. Many organs get many kinds of cancer. And so there are ways in which there is a huge complexity to cancer. I think as we learn more about the genes causing it, it helps us get a little bit more boundary on what are some of the things that are common among cancers that we might be able to target.
As you point out, although we've heard lots about, this becoming more of a chronic disease, we still, all of us, see our friends and family dying from cancer. And yet the same remedies generally, though there are some new techniques, are in play. We hear about chemotherapy, radiation. Those kinds of therapies still are dominant.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of the most disturbing things, frankly, about being a cancer doctor, is that many headlines will tell us about all of the advances in science, and particularly cancer science, and then a patient will come in and you'll have to tell them we really have nothing to offer. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why Michael D'Antonio and I wrote this book, because I think it's important to know how complicated it is to go from a discovery to a new therapy, but that it is happening, and I think it's happening with increasing rapidity, that there are major transformations that are changing the outlook for many patients, but unfortunately not yet all patients with cancer.
Well, just yesterday, before we went in to tape this interview with you, the FDA approved a breakthrough, again, we read the term breakthrough, cancer drug that works on a genetic level. And I think a lot of people, if they saw it on the nightly news on NBC, got very excited about that. Should they?
Yes, these mutations that we know are at the root cause of many cancers, often, now that we've discovered them, have indicated that there is a vulnerability in the cancer that is specifically related to that genetic change. And what that means is that we can start to develop treatments that are not these broad, crude poisons that have been really what you mentioned earlier, the bedrock of treatment of chemotherapy and radiation, but are a much more precise weapon to go after cancer, that are really selected for their ability to go and affect the change in a particular gene that's restricted to the cancer cell. And there are new therapies that are getting approved with increasing frequency that have that kind of precision. And the problem is that sufficient? Is that such a new therapy one that really will completely eradicate the tumor? So far, that has not been the case, but in rare cases it is, and we hope to expand that up by knowing how to use these now in combinations.
Well, I mentioned the media, and I think in 2015, CBS on 60 Minutes talked about the genetic therapies and got everyone's hopes raised. What is the role and the responsibility of the media in all of this, particularly those of us who are always trampling over the internet these days, and we see all kinds of information?
Right. And I have to say, I think that the scientific community has a responsibility here that is not always well met, because, of course, when we as scientists find something that is an exciting discovery, we're anxious to get that information out. That often is picked up by the popular media and expressed to the public. Unfortunately, it's often not given the kind of context that's appropriate, which is to say, yes, it's worked in the laboratory, but no, it won't be available for patients for years. And that's another thing we try to highlight, is that the steps that are necessary are very long and arduous to go from a discovery to something that a doctor can now use and put on his prescription pad and give to you as a person.
I know that you teach at Harvard University, and I think many of us who live in the Northeast, we think, well, if we do have cancer, at least we have Sloan Kettering and Mass General, and those in the Southwest have Anderson. How far ahead are these places from just where people live, and there are cancer centers popping up everywhere? How far ahead are these institutions in looking at clinical trials and such?
There are really two components to what's happening in the area of cancer care, and one is in the diagnosis. In the past, we've understood cancer by taking a sample of the tissue and having a pathologist look at it under a microscope. So someone has a biopsy or has surgery. That's frankly now still used as the basis, but is not the full extent of understanding or selecting therapies. We really do use genetic testing now for many cancers. And unfortunately, that is still a young enough field that that's not widely used in many places. So I think there is a difference between the kind of care that's available at one of these specialized centers compared with a community institution. Now, there are, of course, some community institutions that are fantastic, but I think we're at a point where we're pushing the edge fast enough that not all of the cancer centers in the country or all of the hospitals in the country can keep up. And so it's worth thinking about, at least, considering having an opinion at one of these specialized centers if you have a new diagnosis for a difficult to take care of tumor. So one of the pieces is diagnosis. The other piece is the availability of new drug therapies. And there are certainly community hospitals that participate in clinical testing, but that is really the bread and butter of what happens at these specialized centers. They're really set up so that new therapies can move forward. Now, they have a long history of failure as well as success, so people have to go into this recognizing that, yes, they may sign up for a clinical trial, but it may not help them. It may help someone in the future.
Given that at the beginning I said cancer is not one thing, it's many variations on a horrible theme, but are we gaining ground on certain cancers, and which are the most intractable foes? I mean, many of us hear about pancreatic cancer, and that seems like a very difficult disease for somebody to face.
I guess I have enough white hairs now to say that I've had a chance to see how cancers that, when I was as a young doc in training, considered the intractable, hopeless cases, turn into cured problems. To know that even those challenges that remain difficult today are eventually going to fall, that we're going to be able to identify new ways to approach them. And just some examples that might be helpful is, certainly when I was a child, people, one of my classmates, and I think I mentioned this in the book, disappeared one day because he had acute leukemia. In those days, that was a death sentence, and now it's a 90% cure rate. When I was a medical resident, we had particular kind of leukemia in adults that was a 98% mortality rate. Now it's a 98% cure rate, and it's actually using drugs that are not even standard chemotherapy drugs. I think multiple myeloma has, over the course of the last 10 years, completely changed, as has melanoma, where we previously had essentially no treatments that gave any meaningful benefit. And now, by using our own immune system and finding ways to activate it, melanoma is a very different diagnosis today. It is true, there remain very intractable tumors. Brain cancer, pancreatic cancer, as you point out. I mean, these are areas where there is furious work going on to try to find the crack in the armor of these things. But at this point, we still just don't quite have it.
Dr. David Scadden is with us. The book is called Cancerland, a medical memoir. And when we look at it, have we ever really figured out how these cells go rogue and multiply? Have we really figured that out?
Well, we understand it, I think, with a little bit more clarity. It was, of course, an enormous mystery for time immemorial. And then really with the advent of science in what's called molecular biology, our ability to understand how genes work, that really started to change our understanding of cancer. And I think it's now clear that it's changes in the genes that are the main drivers of cancer. Now, that says that may be one of the mechanisms, but it doesn't really say, well, how does that happen? How do we have that happen to some of us and not all of us? And those things are still, we're having a hard time figuring them out. I mean, it is clear that certain things increase your risk of cancer. But we all know people who also seem to do all of those things that increase their risk and never get cancer. And how it is that some people are relatively protected from cancer and others are more vulnerable, that we still don't have a real handle on. That will be incredibly important.
When we look at the economics and the politics of cancer research, I know you show a lot of frustration about the federal government's refusal to back any research involving embryonic stem cells. and you, of course, pushed to co-found all of this. Help us understand what kind of limitation that places on research.
Research really does depend on the largesse of the taxpayer, because very fundamental understanding about how genes go rogue and cells go rogue is something that depends on the kinds of work that happen in a university setting. A company can't do that work. A company has to answer to shareholders on an every 3-month basis. And so it's really the foundational work that depends on our government, and therefore our fellow citizens, being willing to give something for that work to happen. And it requires people in largely university settings being willing to dedicate themselves to that. I happen to be in a setting where I have a good fortune to see how young people are inspired by wanting to participate and dedicate themselves to that. I can see the talent that they have and that what kind of opportunity their creativity and mental abilities might bring to this challenge. But I see many of them turn away, frankly, and go into other career paths because it is so challenging to be able to count on the funding that's needed to really make a career out of doing this kind of research. Certainly people still do it, and they do it well, and they do it with making a good life for themselves. But I think the urgency of this problem is something that I think we've got to be fully in and dedicated until we really can say to our children that you will have a very different life than we have. You will not know older people or even people your age who disappear because of cancer. You will not have to go into your later years thinking that there is an almost inevitability that you will or your loved one will get cancer. And that, I think, is what we face today. We want to change that fundamentally for people. That has to happen with a concerted effort among the basic scientists funded by governments and those who can apply it in the area of commercial companies.
Do you think we are serious? I mean, we're not using the embryonic stem cells, but also we were told that there was going to be a war on cancer toward the end of the Obama administration, led by the vice president at the time. What's happened to that effort?
Right. That effort is still, I think, early stages and does continue to depend on congressional funding. It is organized. There are the so-called cancer moonshot efforts are being put together, and there is movement in trying to help the research enterprise, if you will, move forward. I think it is starting to have an impact. It's still very early, and it'll be hard to judge how successful it will be at this point. But frankly, I think now we can see the benefit of what President Nixon first did when he declared the war on cancer. And when the National Cancer Institute was established and cancer centers around the country were put in place. Those are the kinds of things that today are changing the outlook for people who unfortunately encounter these diagnoses.
When we see so many cancer facilities and private concerns that say we have better treatment than others, some might worry that we've institutionalized cancer to a point where, if in fact we found the cure, would we be willing to suspend the war on cancer? Is that a legitimate concern?
You know, I've heard that many times. I think it isn't, and here's my perspective on it. There isn't a monolith, a single entity that represents all cancer researchers or all cancer companies. Everybody who's involved in this is in competition to find the critical new way to approach the problem that will have an impact. I think most people that I know who are on the level of either physicians in the trenches, nurses in the trenches, or people doing the basic science, they're there because they want to have an impact on people. They also have to earn a living. But if I think they already indicate they're willing to give of themselves in very fundamental ways just to make a difference for people suffering with this problem. Companies clearly have a whole different set of incentives. But part of their incentive is to come up with a newer, better therapy so that they will be able to win the competition for the healthcare dollars. I think that's very healthy, and if they're too successful, I don't think they worry about that at the moment. And I just, in full disclosure, I'm involved in some of those companies because I want science to be able to move quickly to patients, and that's the only way it can happen. And I can tell you from what I see on the inside of those companies, nobody is talking about, gee, will this be too effective a therapy, and we might end up not having people who will receive it. That's just not part of the dialogue. Maybe someday we'll get there, and I can only say I think that will be to everybody's benefit.
People might find it interesting that you're a hematologist and then an oncologist. And let me read from your book, but as I read more and got involved more, it seemed that clinical oncology research was largely focused on mixing and matching different combinations of poisons. There was a paucity of science beyond pharmacology. Hematology and the study of blood cancers were, in contrast, increasingly driven by the emerging field of molecular biology. So the combining of those two aspects of medicine, how important has that been in your career?
Hematology, because it focuses on blood, and because blood is as accessible as just putting a needle in the arm, has been always one of the leading fields for ways to use science to better understand what is going on with a person with an illness. So we all know when we go to the doctor, if there are any tests done, in general, they're done on the blood. And it's because the blood is an extremely eloquent source of information about many of our other organs and about our general health. But it is also a very clear way of indicating if one of our blood cells has gone rogue and formed a cancer. And because of that accessibility, it's been something that was easier to study at the early days of technology like just the microscope to the current days of understanding the genes involved in the cancer. So it was one of the early fields where science was driving new therapies. That has now extended out very broadly. In my experience now, this is something that is certainly not at all restricted to cancers of the blood. It's still limited for some cancers, things like pancreatic cancer, because it's so hard to access that organ. But all of the areas of cancer research are now benefiting from the application of science to trying to understand the way the cells work and don't work. So I think the science really has driven change. It often does start in the blood, and that may be partly my prejudice as a hematologist, but I think it is something that there is some facts to back up.
Dr. David Scadden, like a few other doctors who have taken their pen in hand, you've done it in such a humane way. And you wrote, when the rewards are so elusive, how do you know whether you are engaged in something meaningful or caught up in folly? Because it takes so long for these breakthroughs to occur, how do you answer that question?
There are many touch points along the way as to whether your science is opening up new ways of understanding and new ways of thinking about problems. We do constantly have to present our work to other scientists in the field and ultimately to the people that fund it. And that really does help you at least gain the perspective and wisdom of others. But if you're someone trying to do new discovery work, there are fewer of those milestones, or at least fewer of those guides that can tell you if you're on the right path or not. And so I think it does take a fairly gritty person willing to take some of the hits of not finding out that your best idea turned out to be a fairly poor one. But fortunately, there are people willing to do that, and it's also, I think there are enough moments along the way when you have a chance to see you've really identified something new and important that it keeps us going. And there's, frankly, nothing more satisfying than having an idea turn into a discovery that you think might ultimately be able to help people. It's an extraordinary privilege.
Well, you have humanized the science of cancer in this book, Cancerland. And to those listening, you write, kindness was sometimes the most powerful treatment at our disposal. And I think that's a very important thing for other doctors to understand too. And I can only imagine that your patients benefit both from your learnedness and, of course, your humanity. The book is called Cancerland, a medical memoir by Dr. David Scadden. Thank you for being with us today on America Trends.
Thank you very much.